as we have seen this morning, to bring together arts, cultural history, and some of history of science can be very rewarding. And I want to thank very much Jeffrey and Angie and Karun to make it possible, and also everybody who is around here, because it has been so fascinating to be here and to speak and to share all what we have been sharing. What I would like to do this morning is not to reread my paper, but I would like to speak about my paper, or around my paper, using a PowerPoint presentation. And I would like to introduce it by using two principles. The first one was just hinted by Jay this morning. It means we've been working together for 25 years, and now we quote the same thing. I was really... The first one is the uncertainty principle by Werner Heisenberg. And the second one, I invented it. I would call it the coincidence principle. So first one, Heisenberg, I quote him: "We cannot observe an object in its purest form as the process of observation itself alters the object." I want to remind you that Heisenberg got the Nobel Prize in 1932, that he worked for the Nazi bomb, or perhaps he tried to slow the process. Till now, we are not sure that he was really a Nazi or he was not. In any case, he was a scientist in a very difficult time. And he had to do research, and we don't know if he had an act of conscience when he went to see Bohr in Copenhagen in 1941, or if he had absolutely no conscience at the time. And I think to begin with, Heisenberg is a good idea for the conversation we had in the last days. Sorry. The second principle is the principle of coincidence. It's probably not so scientific, but it's very often very important. And I have been working for my paper, and I've been very struck when I arrived here with a lot of coincidences. And two of these are related to Apollinaire, with this French poet I've been working a lot about. And the first one is in this poem, Windows. His poem, Windows, is a poem he wrote about the painting of Delaunay you have here. And this poem is a poem about painting. And he did this poem for an exhibit of this painting in Berlin in 1913. And he speaks a lot about this work with Kandinsky, about this work and about the exhibit in 1913. And the coincidence is that these poems begin like that. From red to green, all the yellow dies. And it finishes like that. Vancouver, where the train white of snow and of nightly fires escapes winter. Oh, Paris, from red to green, all the yellow dies. Paris, Vancouver, here, Maintenant, and so on. The window opens like an orange, the beautiful fruit of life. The second coincidence is that Julio González, whoops, this is a poem altogether. Well, you were right, Jay, because I'm doing what I was told to say. Yeah, thank you. Julio.
This is the first time she ever said it was right. 25 years until this happy moment.
Julio González, a great Spanish sculptor, who was a friend, Picasso, was asked by Picasso to do a memorial monument for Apollinaire, who died of the flu, of the Spanish flu in 1918. And this monument, this memorial, was never completed. Gonzalez thought a lot about it, did a model, you have it here on the left, but Picasso really never decided to have it in real size. And the memorial sculpture, which was the idea of shooting stars, dedicated to the man with a star in the head, and the star in the head was the wound Apollinaire had at war. And so this monument never existed. But Gonzalez was one of the main inspiration to David Smith, the great sculptor we have been hearing so much about by Jeffrey. And I was very touched when I realized that David Smith was so important to Jeffrey and that I was coming with my Gonzalez here. So that's why I thought the principle of coincidence is much more important, finally, than the principle of uncertainty. Art above science, perhaps. I go back to my paper and to the presentation. So next, please, because I think you cannot do it. So what I'm going to do very quickly now is by a few images to try to make the points I was making in the written version without images. This one, I try to put together the cover of the almanac and the room in Munich, where was the first exhibit of the Blaue Reiter. And what I think is very striking about it is that the way they exhibit, and I am a museum person, so it's very important for me, the way they exhibit is very banal. They just put the painting in any direction on the wall without thinking about exhibiting very specific words. They have been working so much about changing art, and they don't change the way they exhibit it. And I thought to begin with, it was an interesting way to think about what is modernity and where modernity goes. And you want to show something you have been working so much on, and you show it in a very banal way. The second thing I want to show is Marc Chagall, Homage to Apollinaire. It's a 1914 painting done just finished before the war, at the beginning of the year, and I speak a lot about this painting in my paper, so I will not say much. It could be called Cubist or Orphic Cubism, and for Chagall, it was a way to say something to his mentor, Apollinaire, who had been very helpful for him when he arrived as a poor Russian Jew to Paris to become an artist. So he's trying in a very religious fashion, but his way, to say what is pure art. And it is what we have been speaking about all these days. He speaks about pure art in this painting. He speaks about primitivism in art and in religion. He speaks about paradise, which obviously has to be lost, but can be found again. And he doesn't forget that he's Jewish, so he puts a little bit of Hebraic concepts, but very complicated Herod vision and so on. And it finishes in a totally, I would say, esoteric philosophy, not far from what the one Jay was speaking about this morning. Next one, please. Exhibit at the same time. We are now in New York, and I think it's important to see the international way. It was working already at the time. We don't have to think the world of 1910, 1914 as a world which was closed on little entities. Everybody knew everything about everybody already at the time, in arts, but in science also. And about war, I will speak later about the Balkan War. It was exactly the same. Everybody knew everything. And we have the tendency, I think, to think, because we are in the total age of information now, that we know so much about the world, and they didn't. But actually, they did a lot. And I wanted to show the Armory show of 1913. And you have all the list of the artists. So Jeffrey actually spoke about this Armory show the other day. It's a very important moment. And the second thing I wanted to say about it, it's this photo I found by accident, or the coincidence principle. This photo of cars in front of this Armory show. There is a sentence by Benjamin, dear to Martin, that I quote very often, and which is at my paper, but at another place, which is a generation which had gone to school in a horse-drawn cart suddenly found themselves in a landscape, the one of war, where nothing is familiar except the clouds, and where, in a field of force traversed by tension and destructive explosions, all that remains is a small and fragile human body. And I think this sentence of Benjamin really takes in itself the entire, all the things we have been speaking about. But perhaps one thing we are not speaking about enough is the fragility of human body in front of all the art and the science and the war. Then I go to the almanac itself. I thought it was important to go to the document and really see what was in the almanac. And I chose a number of pages to do the little bit of the exercise they did when they published the almanac. Here you have, on the left, a Bavarian Virgin. Then you have an Eiffel Tower by Delaunay. I will come back to that. Then you have something from Alaska. And then you have drawing by children. And this drawing shows Arabic figure. Next one. Yeah, I choose to put behind this first one a work by Mikhail Larianoff, the Russian painter, because I wanted to to show how he was attracted to what we could call Russian primitivism. This painting of 1911 is called Galloping Hussar. And it's because in my paper, when I speak about this way of going from very modern to primitivism and from Japan to South America and going through any time and any space, I think the artist we went the further on this direction was Larianoff. And actually, I was very happy when Maya yesterday pointed to him. He's really certainly the more interesting figure. And also he has something very special that nobody of them had. He had great respect for his wife, Goncharova, who was a very great painter. And they did things together. And he was not using his wife like the other were, especially Kandinsky. sorry. Next one. So this is, I'm trying to illustrate the page. So this is in color, the Delaunay you have in black and white. We spoke about that yesterday in the almanac. It is a Delaunay Eiffel Tower of 1910. And in front of it, I put a calligram from Apollinaire with also the Eiffel Tower. But if the Delaunay could be used by the almanac, the Apollinaire could not, because it's an anti-German proclamation. At the end of the 2 feet of the Eiffel Tower say, Paris will always fire at the German. It was written before the First World War, obviously. Next one. Another Delaunay Eiffel Tower, which is called Red Tower at the Champ de Mars. And it's very interesting to compare his old way, which was true in the windows, the first one we saw, or on this one, on the Eiffel Tower of 1912, with this new way, which are these rotating circles. He was very quickly fed up with this, what he called the grids of Cubism, and he wanted to find something else, and it is in this circle that he found what he called the dynamic principle, which could help him to convey the light he wanted to convey. And it's just around 1913, 1914 that he's doing this twist. And this twist was very admired and very interested to Marc. Marc has a long correspondence with him, and something I particularly like a lot is correspondence between artists. I think it's a wonderful way to understand artists and to understand the culture of the time. And the correspondence between Delaunay and Marc is absolutely beautiful. I think it's a great one. Next page of the almanac, to see again this incredible space and time. You have a warrior from the Middle Ages, a sculpture, and then you have a sculpture from Benin, from Africa. Then you have a puppet shadow theater from Egypt, and then you have a Kandinsky, which is the composition number 5. So I go to it immediately, next one. And there is something, the real historian of art here, James or Maria, there is something I don't understand. When you see composition number 5 in books, because it's in a private collection now, I even don't know where it is, they put it like that, horizontal. But in the almanac, it is put vertical. So was it because they did not have the space, or Kandinsky wanted one way and they changed the way? And I think it's important to know, because it could be also, if you feel it is already abstract, it doesn't matter. But if it is not abstract, it does matter. And to look at it the way I put it, like it is put in books now, you see here, I don't know how to show that, but you definitely have on the right, you have kind of little towers or churches that are very common at the time in Kandinsky work. But if you put it in the other direction, they are not churches anymore. So it's very, very, we will never know what he wanted to do about that. Another page of the almanac, which is important because there is this Douanier Rousseau, who was a very important figure for all of them. Everybody at the time adored Rousseau. He was French, obviously, but the German loved him very much. And Marc wanted to buy a Rousseau, but he had no money for that because he thought it was so important. a figure by Gauguin, which is a sculpture by Gauguin. And this sculpture is obviously the peak of his primitivism try. And then you have a sculpture also, I don't know how to say that in English, which comes from Greece, from antique Greece. And again, a page of the almanac, which puts together something from the Middle Ages, something from Russia, and something from Egypt. We have, again, this huge range of space and places, which they thought was the best, next one, was the best scene in, no, it is sorry, again the next, was the best in Rousseau. And this is the douanier Rousseau, a horse attacked by a jaguar that Mark loved so much, he wanted to buy it. And the fact that the horse is trying to resist the kind of lion, I don't know how it says jaguar in English, it's a tiger, could be a metaphor of Mark always drawing horses and trying to resist the word, then the war, by his drawing. Again, to illustrate the almanac by the work of the painters of the time, this is a painting, two paintings actually by Gabriele Münter, the partner at the time of Kandinsky. And she's always quoted by Kandinsky because she was very useful because of these two paintings, you could see how their interior was organized. And you have all this sculpture they were collecting, all this Bavarian popular art, all this Russian popular art they were collecting. And Münter was good for that, to record. She was also, next, a very good photographer. And I could not resist to put these few images for Jeffrey of Kandinsky. Kandinsky wearing a typical Bavarian outfit and returning perhaps to the age of agriculture. But he could not return a very long time to the age of agriculture because very quickly war came. Next one. And war came, it's the one before? Yeah. War came with the Balkan War. And I think it's very important here because a lot of historians or art historians assume that there is a premonition in the works of the 1912, 1913 works by all the painters, not only the Blue Writer, but all the painters of the time of the First World War, which is totally wrong, obviously. But they had a war at home. They had the Balkan War. And even before the Balkan War, the first futurist manifest, this one, the one which was the left one, which was published in the French paper in 1909, where they say, we love war, we love the hygiene of war. They are speaking about the Russian-Japanese War of 1905. It was so important in the way the European and the entire world saw for the first time a very tiny little country nobody counted about, Japan, who could win against the huge Russian Empire. And this was very striking for everybody at the time, and the artists are just people like the other. They are stricken by important things. So between the Japanese-Russian War and the Balkan War, and this is a way of Marinetti to try to to say in words, in poetry, what a shell does when it explodes. And so you have it all around the people. Next one is, again, something about futurism. I don't say more. And I go to the war again, to Franz Marc, the wolves. And the subtitle chosen by Marc for this painting is the Balkanic War. So you see, obviously, that he was very much into it. And if he had apocalyptic visions before the war, they were obviously drawn from the reality of this war. And these wolves are very interesting because they say very much what he wanted to say in his work in general, that the man has been losing harmony with the forces of nature, and only animals can keep this inner movement of nature. And he's trying to do it in a more and more abstract way along this year 1913, 14, and 15. And there is definitely under the influence of the rayonist, and I showed earlier, it's two, when I showed Larianoff on the right, you had these red rayons, and it's definitely the influence of Larianoff on also on Marc. And looking the other day at Jeffrey's images of Chauvet and Lascaux, I thought perhaps, I have no idea if it is true, but perhaps Chauvet, certainly not, because it was not discovered at the time. But perhaps Marc had been seeing Lascaux, because there's something in these animals definitely go with it. Again, at the same moment, Kandinsky doing the improvisation number 13, and this one is done in 1913. And in 1913, what does he do in this improvisation? He puts cannons. You can see them very well on the right. So again, there was all literature about Kandinsky anticipating war. No, it just draws what you could see in any newspaper at the time. The cannons, either of the Balkan War or the cannons out of the big firms of weapons competing for different markets everywhere in the world at the time. He wrote a letter that I quote in my paper to an American collectioner called Eddie, where he says, the cannons have absolutely no importance. But probably it was because in 1913 everybody was speaking about the war, so I had to draw cannon. But he says also that the center of the painting is blue, the Blaue Reiter, the blue you spoke about yesterday. And he says that the blue is definitely, I quote him, in contradiction with the impression given by the cannons. I'm not sure Kandinsky write about his own interpretation of his work. Franz Marc, Fighting Forms, 1913. It's also one of the paintings which are always used to say that there was a premonition of war. It's an interesting time in the discussion between the German painter and the French painter, and especially in the correspondence between Marc and Delaunay. It is the moment where Marc decides that he wants to do something different. And he writes to Marker, his great friend, in June 1914, I am German, and I cannot plow only another field than my field. And I don't care anymore about the French painters. It is June 1914. So I love this quotation. I think it's really interesting. And then a new war is coming. This new war begins in August 1914, 1 month after Marc wrote this letter. and how to show this war better than through Apollinaire calligram. A calligram is a way to write and draw in the same time. It is to show what you say by your letters in a drawing. And Apollinaire was one of the best to do that, and one of the first also. And if you're interested, the best calligram explanation is done by Foucault in a very interesting book on Apollinaire. And again, it is not far from Benjamin. Actually, if Benjamin had known this poem by Apollinaire, he would have loved it. Because it is the dialectics, or the contradiction, between the modernity of war, the modernity of this calligram, and this calligram, it is the front of a car. If you look well, you see the headlights of a car. So it's modernity. Apollinaire goes back to Paris to try to join war very, very quickly at the end of July, beginning of August 1914. And he draws his journey through the country to Paris, and he hopes to the battlefield where he cannot go, actually. And what you see very big written in the middle is that the people who take care of horses have to go back to go to the front immediately. So he's in a car, he thinks about the modernity of war through the car, but the people who are asked to go to war very quickly because you really need it are the horses. And Jay, I think yesterday you reminded that at the beginning of the war, the horses were more important. And here in this poem by Apollinaire, which is certainly one of his most famous poems, you have this incredible contrast between the two. The contrast and also the going through wars and the inversion of what they have been believing for a long time. So already in June 1914, Marx thought he had it with Delaunay. And now we are in war. The little car arrived to the front, and Apollinaire, who loved primitive art, he was a great collector of primitive art. And I put on the right this nail statue from the Fang, began to say that the barbarians, which are the Germans, were particularly apt to be barbarians because they were doing nail statues of their heroes. And here on the left, you have a nail statue of Hindenburg. So you can see how the war collapsed modernity, technology, and hate in a very interesting way. And I finish by the last one. It's a cartoon, or nearly the last one, a cartoon of German, very important German paper of the time, Simplicissimus. It is May 16, 1916. And the title of this cartoon is War. It's how he's calling this little painting. Wow, it's not so awful than that, finally.
Really?
And Olaf Gudbrandsen, who is the man from German from Danish origin who did this drawing, I think has been capturing exactly, fantastically well how you go from total art to total war and putting the two together. You see the wounded soldier, you don't see his face. He has definitely something wounded at the arm, but we don't see his face. But we can pretty well guess that his face looks like the Cubist Picasso on the right, which means he has broken face, like the artist, the modernist artist had been drawing before. And in front of him is something which looks between Kandinsky of 1913 and Beckmann of the year 1916 or after. And you have, in the same time, the combination of the knowledge of this art, which could explode the limits of art, and the war, which is exploding the limit of the human being. And you have to remind that when he does this caricature, Mark has been dead for two weeks. And I just finished back to Vancouver and back to very traditional art, tradition of memory, tradition of mourning in a war memorial, 2 of them in Vancouver. This one is a Canadian Pacific Railway memorial in front of the station of Vancouver, where you have the angel of death, or the angel of victory, or the angel of bereavement, which is taking the dead soldier into her hands. And you can read the commemorative plaque, which is so typical of this rhetoric of sacrifice of the 20s, and going very far in space. And again, this is a Japanese-Canadian memorial of the Stanley Park in Vancouver. I found out that there was 190 Japanese Canadians who were engaged in this war, and 54 of them did not come back to Vancouver. And this memorial, which is very typical memorial, with a plaque on the base, then this long column, with a specificity they put a kind of Japanese temple on the top, and it was put there in 1920. That's it.
I think that Jeffrey had wanted to defer to Maria's response. Was that? No?
I really liked the presentation, and what I really appreciated was somebody showing some sculpture, and the Gonzales, which the Gonzaleses, which I haven't seen before. There are very few Gonzaleses that I've seen in public collections, so it's really nice to have him come back up. And about the paper, mostly it's about artists behaving badly, which is like, embarrasses me, no end. But apart from that, I really appreciate it. So I thought that now I would turn it over to Maria. I defer.
All right, Maria.
Is this thing on? Can everybody hear me? I speak quite loudly anyway. First of all, Annette, it was great. It was really nice. You showed me some images that I haven't seen, which is always exciting. Mind you, I would have liked to have seen Natalia Goncharova's forest beside Larianoff's Rayanist work. Of course, her forest was done the same year. And I was so pleased you showed Gabriela Munter. And the mark, the Balkan War, that was totally new to me. So it was great. It's always good to see new images, and you express them so well. Of course, I was left with a lot of questions and some of my own observations. Apollinaire, as Jay, I think, pointed out, was a Slav. And, maybe you could talk a little bit more about his transformation, into that. That's, either we can talk about it ourselves. The others may not be interested. I'm just going to quote just a few things from the paper, since you didn't read it, but you spoke to it through the slides. You began by saying, and I agree, that we should avoid exaggerating the intellectual and artistic harmony of the Avant-Garde in 1911-14. You also talked about the real European, and we have to use the word European rather than international, networks, which are bilateral, multilateral, crossing, reconfigurations, alliances, polemics. I liked all of that. It was very, very good. And you demonstrated in a footnote, alas, however, in your talk, and we've got the image before us, you did talk a little bit about the Blaue Reiter exhibitions in 1911 and 12. And just one observation I'll make is when you see photographs of early exhibitions, the paintings are always, as you know, exhibited in a sort of crazy way. And of course, this comes out of the way in the 19th century and early 20th century, salon paintings were exhibited. You know, if you were skied, that is, if your painting was right at the top of the stack of paintings, you were quite annoyed. And this is, you know, this is the residue of that. I mean, we didn't have curators and people like that around. Of course, you pointed out, and I was glad to see Gabriele Munter there, you talked about the different styles within the Bauhaus movement itself, which is very important. And, you know, it might have been nice to have, you know, just referred to those Russians that I referred to yesterday. And also maybe thought about the exhibitions that Stern had at his gallery in Berlin prior to that, where he brought many of those artists together, French, German, and Russian, which is, you know, it fit in with your argument. Yeah, okay. So, yeah, look, these are just observations, they're not criticisms. And you do say that in your conclusion, and this is where we probably differ, is when the first shots were fired in 1914, they blew to pieces a dream of transnational creativity and transformation. The world has been poorer ever since. And it's interesting that you quote in the same paper, you quote in the same, for which I'm very grateful, you quote in the same paper Kandinsky to Franz Marc, 1914, saying, "I still believe in the future, in a time for the spirit which brings us all together again." And this is where I'd like to make some points. I'd like to just connect a few points that I don't think that we've really connected. Because as an historian, and I'm not an art historian, I'm an historian, I like to see things in a broader light. It's great focusing on, you know, one thing, but I can't help but push it out. Let's just look at Kandinsky. We haven't really got a sense of this guy, really. And we've talked about the cultural apparatus around him, but what about the guy? What about the act of making art? And this is what we've all been trying to strive towards. Well, Kandinsky was influenced, we saw Kandinsky on the land, we saw him, you know, in his Bavarian clothing. But remember, Kandinsky comes out of a culture that certainly in the 1880s and 1890s in Russia, there were two large folk movements, back to the land movements, one headed by a princess, the other by a Razumov, in which they donned Russian clothing, they worked on the land. And Kandinsky was influenced by this. He was also influenced by two very fine art collections, the Morozov and the Shishkin. These are two businessmen who, from the 1880s, went to Paris every year on business and collected paintings. And if you go to Moscow today and you go into the Pushkin or the Tretyakov in Moscow, it's their Chagall's, their Miro's, their Picasso's, their Braque's, all from there. And he saw those. So that was his first exposure, as many other Russian artists, to French painting. And that's what pushed him over to Europe. So he went to Europe. He came back to Russia in 1907. And this is what happened. He was involved in the Blaue Rosa movement. Blaue Rosa, think of it. Their catalog had a blue rose on it. And it was a symbolist movement. And what they wanted to do was to achieve a seamless connection between external forms and inner states of being. So in a sense, this is a sort of symbolist movement. We might have begun with there. We might have looked at their treatise. We might have looked at the fact there's a blue rose on the cover. Just thought about those things. I think this is the genesis of Kandinsky's next move, which was in 1910 to write his treatise, Punkt in linea sur Flaca. And this is, as Martin said that he'd read it, that it does discuss color. I'm ashamed to say that I haven't read it for years, and I should have tried to have gotten a copy of it for the conference. So anyway, we go on to the Blaue Reiter, the Blaue Reiter itself. We've talked a lot about that, and yesterday I alluded to Kandinsky going back to Russia, and of course he wasn't in the war. We have to keep remembering that. He was not a soldier, he was not in the war. And during his time in Russia, he was involved in trying to adopt or adapt, really, his ideas of color through the art school, and then after the revolution, when the academies were abolished, through the new Russian Art Institute. So he did make that attempt, but we all know he came out back to Europe in 1920-21 for the big exhibition of Herwarth Walden at the Sturm Gallery in Berlin. And this was the Erste Russische Kunstausstellung, which Annette refers to in her paper. Very important exhibition, because all of these guys came back. They got a 3-month visa, but most of them stayed. So this is when Chagall came out, this is when Naum Gabot came out, this is when Leschitsky came out, and Kandinsky. And so that exhibition was very important, because what happened after that? What was the thinking at that exhibition? Let me just read you what Leschitsky wrote, and this will try and bring art and science together. The new art is founded not on a subject, but on an objective basis. This, like science, can be described with precision and, in its nature, constructive. It unites us not only through pure art, but also through those who stand at the frontier of a new culture. The artist is a companion to the scholar, the engineer, and the worker. Surprise, surprise, what did Leschitsky do? What did Kandinsky do? What did Naum Gabot do? What did Paul Klee, who'd been part of the Blaue Reiter, do? They all went and became part of the Bauhaus Foundation. And it's now that Gabot writes, if the scientist is permitted to picture to us an image of an electron which under certain conditions has less than zero energy, why is not the contemporary artist to be permitted to search and bring forth an image of the world more in accordance with the achievements of our developed mind? And this line of thinking led to the founding of the Bauhaus in 1919 in Weimar. This is also where I position Geoffrey's art. I see it very much within the ethos of the Bauhaus. We have to remember that the Blaue Reiter group were not isolated. They exhibited, they were published about, Herwarth Walden wrote a lot about them. I think the Bauhaus were one step away from that, and that's where, because I've thought a lot about Geoffrey's work, and I've been a little concerned that we've all said how wonderful it is, and it's so easy to do, because it is, but trying to, for me, to kind of get it into the narrative that we've been trying to drive forth, which I think sometimes has been perhaps subsumed by sound bites about the war, by our attempt to have great theories about, the First World War. And I position his work very much within the Bauhaus, within the, I could go back and say, oh, well, it's kind of Russian constructivist, but no, I would see it in the Bauhaus, the texture, the ideas, the idea of being free from art critics, free from all of this. And that's really all I've got to say. Might I say that after hearing from Annette, I would really like to hear from the students. I feel that, we've said a lot here on the panel, and I really want to get their comments, which I've got snatches of, but perhaps Annette could respond.
Okay, and we'll take, do you still have a mic? Yes.
Thank you very much. I have nothing much to answer. I think what you said about the travels of Kandinsky from Russia and through Russia is fundamental. As I was saying this morning, that the fact he was an Orthodox, and a very devout Orthodox, is very important. And I am not an art historian like you are. I am like you. I am an historian. I am really a cultural historian, but I have a big interest in art. And to be a good cultural historian, as you know, you have to know the language. And I don't know Russian, so I will not be the one to do the work. But there is a big work to do on Kandinsky as a Russian.
Yeah,
then as a Soviet, in a way, even if he escapes it, he wants to be a Soviet for a while. It's very interesting also. So I think you pointed to a very important direction.
Have you considered the Blauer Rose?
Yeah, I know very little about it, but it's true. It is a very important link. I totally agree with you. One of my students, who is a student in Russian, works on that. That's why I know a little bit for her work. And yeah, you are definitely right. And about the other Russians around the Blaue Reiter, and around also the people from the Scandinavian countries. I think this is also an important link that is often missed. But, I mean, the idea also here was more to open to questions. And thank you to bring new ones. I'm really happy about that.
Well, I'd like to give a round of applause to Maria. Jeffrey, did you have any other response at this point, or shall we just launch into the discussion?
I'll hold it back. It's about the Bauhaus.
Okay. So that's great.
But that's skipping our period of time.
That's skipping. Oh, we're skipping. Oh, gosh. Breaking the rules already. So Maria wanted to hear from the students. I would love to hear from the observers what you thought of the works, how you think they're related to the subject, and if anyone has the courage to begin, that would be great. Do we have a taker? Wonderful. Hold on.
I'm glad that some of the women of these smaller movements have started to come up because, like Jeffrey's mentioned, we haven't mentioned much sculpture in this discussion, but a lot of the paintings, and even looking at the Impressionists and Post-Impressionists, everybody that came after, have been male, and typically not considered of the women that were working at the time. And so I'm just glad that started to come up, and that more work needs to come out about Sonia Turk-Delaney and Munter and a lot of these women that were influential at the time. So,
did you have a particular sense when you saw the work that Annette presented of how these artists might have approached some of the questions that we've been grappling with, or was it fully new?
sorry, what was the last part?
Well, we saw a lot of artists who were addressing issues of war, of nationalism. Did you get a sense through their work, did you get a sense through their work that you could understand how they were addressing some of the issues of war and morality and conscience? Or is it too far outside of our time period or too unfamiliar? I'm just wondering if that art spoke to you in any way.
It does, but it does so more from the technical and the formal aspect of it, not so much quite as relative to the time period and my limited knowledge of that time. Just looking to the Goncharovas that I'm familiar with, or the pieces that Sonia Turk-Delaney made, which again weren't shown, but she would create these beautiful quilts made of patched pieces of fabric, which would look like a painting that she would create. But it's a functional piece. It's art that they wanted to bring back to the people. They wanted to sort of bring it back down to the people that created it and make it more accessible. So that's more of what I see in this art. And the fact that they're starting to produce their own small pamphlets, it makes the dissemination of the information more possible. So that's what I see.
Okay, we have Martin J. and then...
Just to speak to the issue of gender, which of course is one that is crucial not only in this period but throughout modern art. There is a tendential link between the stress on Geist and the certain superiority of the male. That is to say, men were assumed to have capacity to transcend and to leave behind concerns of certainly reproduction and of kind of everyday materiality. So that in the very privileging of Geist over matter or over something that was construed as the profane, there was often an inherent denigration of the role of women. And so one might argue that we need to think more clearly about the virtues of materiality and materialism rather than simply assume that spirit, the sacred, whatever we want to call this transcendent principle, is always inherently a virtue. And I would argue that materiality, materialism, there are lots of ways to think about it. And we think about it in terms of positivism and a kind of perhaps prosaic version of science. But we also might think about it, first of all, in historical materialist ways, in the old, even Marxist vocabulary of looking at historical materialism in terms of the matrix of production out of which art emerges, and to think seriously about that. Because although artists occasionally can be lucky enough to avoid commodification or avoid being part of networks and apparatuses of constraint that are economic, it's very rare that they can do that. Secondly, we can think of materialism in terms of the body, and in terms of the senses, and in terms of desire, and in terms of sexuality, in terms of all the things that spirituality seems to feel embarrassed by and tries to leave behind, which may have gender implications, but not always. But these are things that art can never fully escape. And that is to say, the difference between the aesthetic, broadly understood, and either knowledge or the religious or other notions of absolute transcendence is that it involves the body. I mean, his thesis is, of course, precisely that. I mean, from the 18th century on with Baumgarten, it had to do with the senses. And so art has a kind of quality of perhaps sublimation, transcendence, but never leaving the senses behind. Conceptual art, to the contrary, notwithstanding, and the dematerialization of art that involved, as it is often called, notwithstanding. And then third, there is also a counter-movement away from the elevation and sublimation of Geist in this period associated with the base materialism of the, let's say, dissident wing of surrealism, most associated with people like Bataille and Léris and others, which emphasizes a materialism that resists being coerced by form, resists being coerced by a kind of spiritual elevation. Bataille attacks Breton for images of the eagle soaring above, or images of, you know, the imperial Napoleonic symbols or whatever that involve leaving behind the messiness of the body, the messiness of both the reproductive and the, let's say, excessive, grotesque body. So all these are countercurrents to a somewhat ideological notion of Geist, which has, among other things, problematic gender implications. And I think that's one of the, in a way, limitations of a certain discourse which simply takes Geist and sacredness and theosophy and spirituality and the occult, leaving behind the material world as if it were a self-evident virtue. And that's one of the limits of high modernism as well, as many people have pointed out.
Oh, yes, but when you look at Canadian painting, certainly the women artists in the 10s, 20s, 30s, 40s, they were the ones, as well as a few of the men, that really, like Emily Carr, that really absorbed all of this theosophy.
Well, there's no question that there's identification with the aggressor, and that you have women who thought they had to establish themselves by leaving behind what constituted the, let's say, not specificity in the general terms, but at least the cultural identifications with things feminine. So that
A lot of them still remain very
well,
feminine.
it's a complicated, I think, compromise that some made. I mean, we'd have to talk about specifics. So that some, to become, in a way, successful meant that they had to suppress those aspects that were hitherto construed as objective. Now, not always. I mean, you know, we could talk about specific examples of people who maintained, you know, connections with both. But a kind of, let's say, normativization of Geist or sublimation or whatever you want to call this thing that leaves behind the body could be pursued by women who also sought to become part of the club, we might say. And that there was, you know, a certain rebellion against that on the part of other women artists in the 20th century. So, you know, we'd have to look more carefully at gender and the various manifestations of these issues in specific cases. But I think certainly for this group of people at this time, it was a problem. So maybe there are, you know, let's say certain artists we can point to who avoided it.
Exceptions.
Yeah, yeah. No, I mean, these are pretty big generalizations.
Yeah.
But at least it introduces issues that are worth, especially because gender is on the table, worth taking seriously.
Yeah, go ahead.
Just add a word. There is, to my knowledge, only one very interesting militant woman at the time. She's a futurist, and she's called Valentine Saint-Point. And she writes incredible text at the time, very early for her time. And at the same time, she's an incredible nationalist and wants war even more than the futurist male who are around her. So things are very complicated.
We'll go to Jennifer. Mike is. Do you want to wait? We can go to James
no,
and
I
come
just
back.
thought of it. Just something that just occurred to me, and I thought people who know about this would be able to tell me maybe, is that what kind of viewership did this sort of stuff have? Did the Blaue Reiter have, you know, as compared to other avant-garde movements, as compared to sort of just other popular art? Like, so if you're in a city in Europe and there's a big exhibition on, like, that lots of people are going to, is it this sort of stuff? Is it other stuff? Like, you know, basically, where is this situated culturally in terms of popularity and popular culture?
And is that addressed to Maria, Annette, or both? All right.
Well, I think these sorts of things, you know, they're trends in what is popular from the past. Right now, there is, I think, a big Blau, because we're in the 100th anniversary. Maybe that's why, you know, Jay chose this as a subject today. They are 100 years old, I guess. But I tend to think that exhibitions, it is what is popular. It's when there's a centenary. You know, Art Deco was in a few years ago, and, you know, Turner was in 30 years ago. Lots of exhibitions about Turner, and then they seem to fade, and then they come back. So, Annette, you may have an answer. Oh, at the time. Oh, there were lots of groups. There were lots, I mean, you know, as Lynn said yesterday, De Stiel in, you know, mentioning Mondrian and you know, Die Brücke in northern Germany, which, you know, we could have also explored. Yeah, I mean, there are lots of groups around.
And were they, I guess, somewhat hard to believe from our standpoint that this was popular art, quite frankly.
I'm not sure I really understood your question. Do you mean, no, it's my English, sorry, and you speak very quickly. I used the Australian accent. You mean popular in the fact that people wanted to see their work, or popular in the sense that they were near the popular culture through the people coming to see it? No. You have to... Don't forget that they were totally marginal. What we call avant-garde in our military vocabulary were back-garde, that's what it's in English, in the reality. It means that the popular art, was the art of the salon, Maria was speaking about before. And the impression is were beginning to be very popular at the time they were dying. And they were not popular at all. And especially in Germany, when there was awful polemics against them. And they had to fight all the time.
Annette, it would be interesting, though, to have the figures. I mean, we can't get these, but how many people attended those two exhibitions
Very
of
few.
the Blaue Reiter?
Actually,
I
very
just don't
few.
know.
And the one of, the only one I have been working really about it is the one in Berlin, in that room, where Windows, I began my talk with, was exhibited. And there were so bad reviews that the owner of the gallery asked Apollinaire, who was the most famous poet at the time, to do a favorable review of Kandinsky that Apollinaire did to please the guy because he wanted his friends to be exhibited in his gallery. But it is a very, very small world, and it's not popular at all.
So at the time of the Blaue Reiter exhibition then, say there's lots of exhibitions happening in town, like what would be the biggest one? Like what was the art that lots of people were going to see and was being favourably reviewed at that time?
At the same time, at Munich, there was the kind of work called the Secession, and the one would be the popular art. Yeah. This one was seen as marginal and crazy, actually.
So
Especially by the use of color and all what Martin and James answered yesterday. It's mainly around that. They could not buy it, and the different reasons have been given yesterday afternoon.
But people were going to the Academy exhibitions, the annual, official Academy exhibitions.
I'm going to just cut that. We can get back to it. I do have a couple of questions as well. But let's get to James while he still remembers what he wanted to say.
Yes, I also wanted to respond to the final lines of your paper when you said that, of course, the war blew to pieces the dreams of a transnational creativity and transformation, and the world has been poor ever since. I want to say something that's maybe a bit cheeky and something that will probably infuriate everyone in the room, but I think the First World War in many ways improved art and improved modern art. Now, it didn't improve it if you judge modernist experiment as the only measure of the quality of art, and certainly it did kill so many great artists. But if we take other parameters, other ways of judging what this did to modern art, it was in some ways a great deliverance. We see and this also goes back to what Jeremy was talking about autonomization, about a separate sphere of art moving away from society. And this is something we were talking about here, about how many people went to see these shows. In the grand scheme of things, what these people were doing was pretty much irrelevant. And it was the First World War that forced artists and forced modern art to become accountable and to have to come to terms with a society that it had to justify its existence in. And I think many modern artists came of age during the First World War. The First World War was the first opportunity for them to actually make art that actually had a social function, whether this was to memorialize the dead, whether it was to help people cope with the difficulties they'd faced, whether it was to help people understand what actually happened in the war and see the war. And I think without the First World War, we wouldn't have had these sort of great developments that happened during and afterwards. The Bauhaus, a modernism that had a kind of social agenda, a political agenda. Dada, which of course had a very strong political agenda. So I think if we shift the criteria, and I think it's about time that art historians particularly shift the criteria from formal experiment. The First World War is not quite the artistic tragedy that people think and have seemed to think it is.
Okay, so...
Artist needs to speak, please.
Okay, then leave it.
Those are fighting words.
Then leave
And
it.
I'll say how they're the fighting words.
Okay.
Interesting things happened after this. Afterwards, Picasso, and this may happen to young painters easier than it happens to sculptors, but I really see it in the work. As to the Bauhaus, I always had a lot of faith in the Bauhaus, but lately I don't, because I think Gropius really regarded art as a craft, and it went back to being a craft once it went into the Bauhaus, which in turn turned the artist back into a petty functionary again. This is very serious. You can say no. I see it in Kandinsky. Kandinsky starts to stylize his work. That late Kandinsky is very stylized. It just fits. It's like he's coasting on Kandinsky. And I find it very stylized and not nearly as raw or as good as it was before.
Someone like Liszewski.
Well, Liszewski had a position to take once he came out of Russia. And I think the Bauhaus was a home. I think that was great. I think it was true of Gabo as well. After Lenin died in 1923, it wasn't 1933 when all of this disappeared.
Well,
it's 1923 when Lenin died. After Lenin died, the shift started to happen, and those guys got out. And so they actually found a home.
Well,
and I
some
think
of them
that's a really
stayed.
plus.
Tatlin and Malevich, they stayed until 1933. in their
I know they
positions.
did. But look at late Malevich. It starts becoming early Impressionism. Come on, that's a step backwards. Malevich disappears at that particular point. Okay, so we already destroyed Kandinsky. Let's keep destroying here. Picasso becomes a victim of his success. And all of those Picassos, those late and middle Picassos in 1923 and 1924, they're just Picasso doing Picasso. It's like De Niro doing De Niro, you know, and Jack Nicholson doing Jack Nicholson. You know, he becomes a victim of his own success, and from that point on, he's Picasso doing Picasso. Sorry, just destroyed him as well. So these are some of the people from that particular time. It doesn't happen to Brancusi. Brancusi does some of his greatest work after that time. So from a sculptor's point of view, and Gabo does as well.
What about Gabo?
Yes, he does too.
Wonderful work.
So we're talking about sculptors maturing later because they don't sell anything. That's the reason why. They can't become a victim of their own success because that just is not in the cards. On the other hand, painters can, and Picasso had become so famous by that time. It's Picasso doing Picasso. I see so much of that work afterwards, and it's like, and I see this, Matisse becomes Matisse. And there's a lot of sleepers after that, and so when you say it improves, you're going to have to come up with a lot newer artists. Like Klee comes into his own. I agree, Klee comes into his own, easily comes into his own after the war, or during and after the war.
If we're thinking about experimentation, certainly Picasso...
But he was younger, by the way.
Pardon?
He was younger, of course. Klee was younger.
Yes.
Yes. So
well,
he's at a very initial stage. It's very hard to find early Klees.
I mean, I could give you a number of examples, but I mean, certainly I know British art best. But let's put aside British art. Say someone like Fernand Léger, a great French painter. I mean, he saw the First World War. He was in Verdun with all these terrible things were happening, and what he saw was a chair on a tree, stuck on a tree, and said, "This is the great vindication of modernism." You know, and for Léger. Yeah, well, no, but the thing about Léger is, of course, before the First World War, he was moving into these very sort of abstract terrain and very beautiful pictures in their own right. And for him, the First World War was the moment when he got in touch again with the French people. He was there serving. He saw real people, and he realised that the direction his work had to take. Yeah, lots of. But I mean, he felt that the direction his work should take is not away from the people and towards this sort of hermetic experimentation, but back towards a sort of constructive relationship to society, where the figure came back, the subject came back, the city came back. And I think that makes his art all the more interesting and rich. That's my view, anyway. I mean,
okay. I'm going to just go to Liba, because she was very patient, and then to Dr. Winter, and then to Peter. Okay, and then we'll go directly to Dr. Winter.
Okay, I want to raise a point about Annette's paper on anthropology. I thought this was fascinating. There are 2 points here. One is the Serbian friend of Kandinsky, Dmitry Mitronovic, whom I didn't know about before this, who did produce another almanac called Towards a Future Humanity Across Aryan Europe, where it sticks a little bit here and there. But nonetheless, there is a sense in which we're measuring the non-European against the European. The art of humanity is going to create. It's not the art that Europeans are. And on page 22 of your paper, let's see if I can get the exact quote. It's Mark. For those of you who have it, we should look to the text. Let's see where it is. one more page, sorry. Yes, I have spent some productive time in the Ethnographic Museum. I was finally caught up, astonished and shocked by the carvings of the Cameroons people. Carvings which can perhaps be surpassed only by the sublime work of the Incas. I find it so self-evident that we should find the rebirth of our artistic feeling in this cold dawn of artistic intelligence rather than in cultures that have already gone through a 1,000-year cycle like the Japanese or the Italian Renaissance. In this short winter, I've already become a completely different person. To call ourselves artists, we must be brave and give up almost everything which until now was dear and indispensable for us good Central Europeans, which I think means Florence, among other things. Our ideals and ideas must wear a hair shirt. Now, this is another way of looking at the issue of internationalism. And my question is this. In the two papers I did and in the two papers I've heard, I'm not sure that internationalism survives our inquiry. It looks to me to be a surface, a code of hope, maybe, a code of possible cross-cultural exchange, but no more than that. As you show, Annette, for Apollinaire, it's nothing. It really means nothing when it comes right down to it. And here, they're talking about internationalism as not Europeans working with each other, and after all, you know, they're competitive powers. But there's an internationalism across ages, across civilizations. And I wonder whether that was what the Blaue Reiter was all about. You know, when you talk about the organization of the design of the almanac, why are there so many sculptures and images of a non-European kind? Why are they there? And I think because European art isn't what they mean by international. They really have this notion of humanity, if you will, which goes beyond Europe. And I wonder whether the anthropology that I just cited on two is really at the heart of the project that you wanted to identify. I'm not sure where Apollinaire fits into this story, but it is such a large part of your analysis that I'd like to draw you out on it.
Sure. That's why I did a part about it, because Kandinsky was a student in anthropology for a while, and he hesitated between anthropology and law, and finally quitted everything to be a painter. Yeah, no, it's very important. I think they are the children of colonization, but they are the children of colonization who have been thinking a lot about it. And Apollinaire fits very well because he wanted a study of the mask he was buying. Because for some of them, and probably it was true for Marker, who writes the article Mask of the Blaue Reiter almanac, they are a piece of art. But for him, they were not. That's why during the war, when he makes fun of the German with their nails in the statues and saying they are barbarian because they do like the African, he's contradicting himself. Because before the war, he wanted schools of thinking about the art he was buying from Africa, or he was seeing in galleries from Africa. And he had a very anthropological and open mind, and I agree with you. He was, and also some of the Germans, Mark, for example. Mark, when he arrives in Paris, the first thing he does, he doesn't go to try to see Matisse. He wants to see the mask in Trocadero. It is what he wants to do, to compare with the one he has seen in Berlin. And they are, I would say, one step before the anthropologists. We were sort of taking everything, the most they could, sort of really picking from the word they want to understand. And
the culture, and it's really a colonial attitude to works of art, which I find, I'm writing right now an article on skepticism and native art. And
they definitely have a colonial view, because they want to have it, and they don't want the people have their culture and their cult on the spot.
But they don't really understand it. They can look at it from their aesthetic point of view.
They want to think about it, which is one step aside the real colonizer who don't give a dime about the thing they see.
Well, can I just point precise for James. Is your hypothesis testable over whether there is a greater appreciation of the reality of non-European art after the First World War than before? I mean, it's the biggest imperial war in history. We don't have to play with that. But here is a particular element that they're obviously inadequate in their appreciation of the art that they're celebrating. What about after the war? Does it get better? I mean, if you think about the Picasso's interest in primitive art, I think there was a profound understanding of part of it, not all of it, but part of it.
No, there have been exhibitions and books written about this, Jay.
Okay.
The fact that it's not understood and it's appropriated, and there's a whole literature.
Entirely, without even exception. That sounds a bit too monolithic.
Well, when you just read it, find out.
All right. I think we do probably want to come back to it. I'm sure Jeff has something to say on that. I have 3 more people, and I noticed that you were twinging there as well. Yeah. Okay, we'll come back to that. So let's just get Peter, because he's been very patient.
I've really got 2 points to make, but I think they're linked. First is really to talk about the impact of modernism, and here I'm generally in support of James's perspective on the First World War as a liberating experience which ushers in modernism, as we can see if we look not just at art, fine art in this sense, but if we look at other artistic endeavors. Let us look, for example, at literature. Certainly in English literature, it's in the immediate post-war period. You get that explosion of modernism in poetry with the Anglo-American T.S. Eliot, or drawing on the work of Ezra Pound, W.B. Yeats coming through. You have the work of Virginia Woolf being appreciated in a European context in the 1920s. You have the Irish writer, of course, James Joyce, with this explosive publication of Ulysses. Where is it published? In Paris, of course, at that time. So this is clearing the ground for a modernist aesthetic that goes beyond just art, because many of these people also have been involved in promoting post-impressionism and artistic movements before. But my second point then is this, that we're all very attentive as historians to context these days, but in this sense, there are 2 sorts of contexts that are important. Let's distinguish between them: a context of creation and a context of reception. Let's not muddle them up. And perhaps if we talk about a context of reception, then we see then what is popular, what is received, what evokes a response is the important thing in this sense. And this links then, doesn't it, with the point we were just discussing about the reception of so-called primitive art from the developing world, the outside world, the post-colonial world, however we want to term it there. There, we're actually not concerned so much from this perspective with the context of creation, with the motivation of the artists, if we can even call them that, who made it in the first place. What changes, crucially, is a European or a transatlantic context of reception in which it is appreciated differently, maybe wrongly, as Maria was arguing, maybe on the basis of creative misconceptions there, but it is the context of reception that is crucially different, I would have thought, by the 1920s.
Interesting. Do we have any, you made so many interesting points, I'm wondering if we want to actually address any of them. Anybody from the panel have a...
Well, I want to say that's a very subtle distinction there and a very important one. And of course, the other art forms, I mean, the most socially, if you like, directed art forms, architecture and design, they flourish after the war, not before the war, in terms of modernism. So that's something not to be forgotten.
And not just in the Bauhaus, there's the circle movement, which brings, later in England, which brings in British, Russian, French, Slav artists into it. So this idea that internationalism somehow goes.
Jay had something?
Yeah.
Then Jeff?
I'd like to parallel Peter's statement by saying that we ought to notice the astonishing public projection of Einstein's science in the immediate post-war period in 1919, you know, where the experiments proving that there's actually curve, the measurements proving that his theory actually has experimental validation, turned him into a star, a scientific figure of a kind that I don't think existed in the pre-1940s. There were people, of course, of great eminence, but I think Einstein's position right in 1919 makes the distinction between the creative moment, which is before the First World War, and the popularization of what he had done at a very turbulent moment with lots of other headlines about civil war in Russia. And imagine Einstein is the headline, is the major headline, and the Russian Revolution is the minor headline. This brings us back to our issue that scientists are also engaged in a series of distinctions between their creative moment and the reception of the ideas that they develop. And the other example of that, I think I have doubts about some part of the liberation thesis. It still sticks in my throat, but some of it must attach. But some of it must attach to Freud. Must attach to the First World War as a moment where the idea that perfectly normal people can go mad under certain circumstances, and we don't have to go to the issue of childhood sexuality to explain it, but the popularization of insanity as a reality in which with which we have to deal with is something that had to be faced in the aftermath of the war. And Freud became that's why Joyce was able to talk about a girl who's young and easily frightened in his writing. And he was right, too. Thank you.
Can I just say something about Einstein? And I want to bring women in here again, and that is the recent work that has been done on Einstein's wife, who was a physicist, who in fact helped him develop the theory of relativity. They divorced right after he won the Nobel Prize, and he paid her off with the Nobel Prize money. And this was told to me by a scientist at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton. So just wanted to get that in. So every time we say Einstein, let's remember that, the old joke, behind every man stands a surprised woman.
Can we? Go ahead, Jeff.
Peter, that's not meant about you, not at all.
Firstly, I'd like to revise what I said, James, in that the artists who were really well known before the war, that's what I'm pointing out, start to copy themselves after the war. So you then have to name a whole group of new people who themselves become recognized afterwards, except for Brancusi, of course. You missed the American writers, Hemingway and his group. So I thought I'd throw that in. The other aspect of it is what comes on is that period of defiance, which I think is really important that I talked about, and also the period of resignation stated as defiance. That's mainly around Duchamp.
Hang on a
Most
second.
of the rest of the data don't go there.
Can you turn him up? Jeff? No, it's hard to hear back there.
Hello, 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 hello. No? Yes, no? No. I quit.
Any better?
I lost the thought. No, I didn't lose the thought. So that's an important thing about newer artists and artists who weren't known before, and the period of defiance. This is where I see Dix coming in to his own, George Grosz coming into his own. He hardly did anything before there. Clay coming into his own. So that's actually a group of people who sort of appear before and sort of connect to, but don't come until afterward. And so that fits. Modernism in architecture, yes, obviously, that's true. Music, Schoenberg had already done a lot of his work. I'm trying to think where he is at that stage, because he starts to go into serial music afterwards. So the earlier work that's truly atonal was done, I think, before the war. Yeah.
Annette, do you have a response to this, or should I, or new?
It's a very short comment about what James said, and Peter and Marianne, actually, Jay and Jeff said. Don't you think in all that there is a question of generation? And you have to take in account the age of the people before the war, during the war, and after the war. And it works very well with artists, I mean plastic artists, with musicians. You were just referring to Schoenberg, and what about Berg, and about the writers. And I think we could have as many examples in one direction and the other direction if you take individual things. And just to finish with the argument of James, I really agree with that. Because what is in the conclusion about the world was poorer after was coming from the Blaue Reiter. It was a paper on the Blaue Reiter, and the Blaue Reiter explodes. But and Mark dies, and so many others die. Marker, which somebody said yesterday, we have so few of, Jeffrey, you said that. We have so few of his paintings. That's true. He was somebody who was thinking a lot before painting, and he had no time to think because he was killed in September 1914, immediately. So it is what was in the end of this paper. The war has been just killing people. But it has not been killing ideas, it has not been killing movements, and it has been also at the heart of new ways of seeing the body. And I think that the Dada could exist because they could speak about smashed bodies. And it is from the smashed bodies and also from the mask that the Janko was doing in Zurich in 1915. Perhaps this mask were also the mask of Marker he was doing. Perhaps unconsciously he was going on with the Blaue Reiter. That there was after Dadaism and Surrealism and on and on. So it's a question of the age in the thing. And so generation and also the continuity, and I think the history in general goes through continuities, because if not, there would be no history. And also it goes through the cut. And the war is in the same time, a continuity and a cut. And I think it depends where you put your cursor to see the continuity of the cut. But you have the two together, obviously.
There's a statement of irony here, especially Marinetti, to see that the purging by war, the hygiene of war actually means getting rid of artists. And that brings up the canary, and that means the canary in the coal mine. In the coal mine. Somebody pointed out, Dick Goldman pointed out that, of course, the canaries died. So there was so. But they gave their lives so that others might live. Yeah, but then Liebe asked the question of whether or not the scientists could be canaries in the gold mine, or canaries in the mine, and I think that the answer to that is they're too valuable. No, the expendables are the artists.
Marie Curie died because of X-ray experimentation in the First World War. She was too exposed to X-rays to the point that she developed the cancer that killed her. And she was valuable, to say, what, a woman, the only woman with 2 Nobel Prizes, I think. The only one.
I could say many things about that, but we will move on to Jenny. Jenny, you still remember where? And then Jeremy.
It's good stuff to try to remember everybody I wanted to say something to. So I'll try very quickly here. This may be a bit too personal, but because I'm thinking about the development of anthropology after World War II, now I'm beginning to wonder if some of these avant-garde ideas helped shape the development of cultural anthropology, structural anthropology, comparative anthropology, sociology, and all of this. And maybe somebody can offer some insight there. Primitive art, I think it's important to remember that modern artists who bring in primitive forms are not just concerned with formal qualities or just the sort of spirit of, sort of bringing the world to the sort of colonial capital, but also critiquing the way that primitivism is used as a strategy to sort of police the barriers of modernism. I mean, there's really an awareness, we see that in Gauguin and Picasso, the use of, cultural use of primitivism as this kind of strategy. Also, this is very simple, really, but just to add, especially between the wars, we see massive spread of sort of popular culture, popular forms such as Art Deco architecture. So I think that needs to be maybe part of the equation here when we think about internationalism between the wars.
Can somebody address that? Were you just generally putting it out there? Yeah, please.
Point about this. I'm worried about the word essence in anthropology, the essentialist vision. That's why I cited the idea of an Aryan almanac. That, the reason why it's stuck is obvious, but at the same time, I think there is in your paper some citations which imply an essentialist view of the primitive, that they have a different essence to us. They are somehow, and that's why we have to get rid of Europe and go back to them and so on. And in the 1920s and 30s, this is explosive. This is dangerous, toxic stuff. And I'm not sure anthropology is unified at all, but I think there are elements of it that reinforce the notion of racial essence as much as there are elements of it that critique it. Bauhaus is a perfect example of that. But the tension between the two doesn't seem to me to be evident, and I don't know if this is true, Annette, whether you'd agree with it, but the way they read it as on the first order. It's a first order reading of these Inca materials. I don't hear the contradictory and sophisticated reading that you're referring to. I think they're stuck in the view of essence, and essentialism kills. It's a dangerous position to adopt. That's where Boaz went. Absolutely,
yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah.
But I don't read Annette's paper that way. I don't know how you.
Oh,
yeah.
I think just the word primitive makes me cringe. I don't know how anyone else feels, but just to hear it bandied about primitive, we're using it the way they used it, and I find that slightly uncomfortable.
Some of the euphemisms are not much better. That's the problem. The first peoples, it's said with such a condescending smile usually.
Well, it's certainly better than primitive.
Barbarian. Can we?
Barbarian.
Can we go to Jeremy, who's been?
Yeah, that's the best.
This is just a very quick point, kind of in line with the discussion that's been going on about periodization and James's provocation about the actual impact of World War I. It's just been very striking to me. Obviously, the time period we picked is 1900 to 1914, and we're historians. And World War I and the big world wars in the 20th century provide such good loci for kind of citing, conversation, and specialization. But it's surprising to me how much the discussion can go on without the mention of World War II. And I think there's something to that, which is one of the reasons why we might be inclined to see World War I as such a disaster, is because we are inclined to read the history, a kind of history of a downward spiral from Versailles to the death camps. And that's a very easy move to make, but clearly there's, and we've already heard many of the examples, but there is an attempt to get all of the internationalism that you had before World War I back on track again. So the peace movements break down before World War I, then they reform. Various artistic communities break down, then they reform. We can think of Weimar as a terribly foolish experiment, but clearly there are lots of people who were working hard at coming up with some alternative future that we now see as doomed to failure, but that certainly, some people didn't see that way at the time. And then clearly there's what's going on in the Soviet Union, where
we wouldn't be sitting in this building.
Right. You have a whole hopeful idea of internationalism coming from the East that we also now see is turning out pretty poorly. So I'm just I just see that. I see in some ways the shadow of World War II shaping the thesis, the kind of the declensionist thesis around World War I, and kind of inclining us towards that conclusion.
Okay, go ahead, and then we go to Sarah.
One thing that I have a perception of, and I think others do as well, is that it's a 31 years war. It begins in 1914. It runs to exhaustion. You've got so many millions dead on either side. It needs rest. The war doesn't end. It just simply requires new cannon fodder. It takes another 20 years to build it. So if you said, we need 20 years to keep this thing going, guess when you go to war again? Exactly. So that's the way that I see it. What goes on is a respite in that time, and I agree with you. These things happen among artists, writers, other people. That transformation happens in the respite, but it is only a respite. It's a respite because that war never ended. It just didn't. You can't just explain Weimar or do any of those things unless you see it as a continuation of one into the other. This is just an excuse to like stop for a while. Whereas there's a vacuum that's left, and a lot of new work comes into that vacuum, and a lot of cynicism comes into that. We have to look at Dix and Gross and the Dada and Hemingway and the group of American artists. The cynicism that grows into that particular period grows out of that war. So it's, I think it should never be thought of as not being continuous. I think that it's a continuous war that just takes a respite. So when you look at what goes on in that period, 1918 to 1939, you're really looking at a respite. And if you look at it as a respite, then I think you see it differently than trying to anticipate World War II. World War II was, from my perspective, I think was a foregone. I mean, if you look at the Versailles Treaty and everything that happens from that Versailles Treaty, it just leaves it wide open that the war didn't end. It just sort of petered out for now. It was bound to happen again. So it wasn't that it was anticipated. It just couldn't go on any longer until you had another generation who were willing to fight it.
Jay, weigh in on this one as well?
I'm of two minds about it. On one hand, this world of the Blaue Reiter and the world of the German army in which Franz Marc served is not the world of the Nazi army. It's a different place, a different atmosphere. There was a toxic change which must be related to the fact that at the end of the war, the Russian Revolution launched a counter-revolution, a series of counter-revolutions that brought the Nazis to power, and the Italian fascists, of course, whatever. But what I'm struck about, more and more I study it, is how similar the German army, the British, the French army, Italian, is in the First World War, and how different they are in the Second. How the Second, there is a different structure of military ideology in the Second World War that's not there in the First. The people who really believe in the Nazi project are running the war effort as racial extremists, and they do the job. Now, the German army was in Jewish centers of population, or centers of Jewish population in the First World War II. You have some anti-Semitism, but almost none of that. There is a radical change in the middle, which you may be right, may have been precipitated by the First, has something to do with the Depression. But I don't know what you think, Martin. You've written a lot on Weimar. I see there as a radical discontinuity between the Kaiser's Germany and Nazi Germany.
I mean, as a historian, you're always aware of contingencies and multiple possibilities and the sense of history not being in any way foreordained. So, although I think retrospectively there is some, let's say, warrant for talking about the 31 or whatever the precise number of years as a kind of package, but a lot of things could have gone in different ways. And so as a result, I think most historians would be loath to see it quite as unified and as inevitable. But there are, of course, ways in which, let's say, the wounds of the First World War were not fully healed, and the likelihood or the possibility of some sort of continuation was there. Now, the precise form it took, the Russian Revolution, the Nazi Revolution, the Depression, all these were not latent in World War I. They were not part of Europe's destiny. So I think we have to be very careful about overemphasizing the inevitability of that. But having said that, you know, Europe's Civil War, I think Lichtheim called it that as well, during this, you know, the first half of the 20th century, does have a kind of narrative coherence. So I'll sort of grant it as a, let's say, heuristically interesting way to conceptualize the links between the two, but without falling into any notion of inevitability or something that was foreordained, or just seeing it as something that was just working out as something that was latent after the failure of, say, the peace in 1918.
Yeah, it could have been defeated, but what I see is the difference in the army had to do with what it meant to be stuck in those trenches. So Hitler went for a totally mobile army in the second, in the second one, and designed it. And the Americans and the Brits, this is critical. They started their airplane program and went for long-distance bombers, and the Germans didn't. They used the Dornier, and the Henkel was supposed to be just a flying coffin. So they had no real way of winning that Battle of Britain. That was nothing but some terror bombing, and then they destroyed the Air Force. So the Germans already designed their Air Force to be a tactical Air Force rather than a strategic Air Force. And that meant that already meant from the word go, of supporting an army that would go back and take that land back, because that's the only reason to have a tactical Air Force. And that was what developed from World War I on, partly because of the restrictions of Versailles, but also once Hitler came to power, that's where the planning went. And so it went right back to a land-based, fast-moving army, and that was very, very different than the trench warfare that they were stuck in.
That's true.
World War.
I think we'll go to Sarah now. Hang on.
Can't hear.
We can't hear anything.
Broach the subject of the Second World War, and with the Blue Reiter looking at the artistic movement before the First World War, if we can see how Hitler treated the artists of the day and his artistic intentions with the ideas that he wanted for that society, if we can see his dismissal of modern art, and as sort of I don't want to say anything too large or too grandiose, but that he recognized the power that it could have and tried to quash it and emphasize the naturalistic, the neoclassical parts of art that he enjoyed, because they weren't as dangerous as the Blue Reiter had been or as these other artistic movements. So, just a thought.
Okay. Can anyone weigh in on that? Yeah, Annette.
I'd like to answer to you about that, because it's a question I've been working a lot on, and I'm very interested about degenerate art. Because as you probably know, the person who did write the first about it so well is George Mosse. George Mosse, I've been thinking about that a lot, about the way it was a veteran, Hitler, from the First World War, who could not accept the way Gross or Dix or Bachmann were showing his war. And they were also all veterans. So it was veterans against veterans. So it goes exactly in what James and Peter said about the fact that these people were out of the Great War, and they were out in certain ways. And Hitler was also out of this war. And at some point, there is a proclamation, some Dada proclamation saying that we are doing history. That's why we do that. And in 1937, the people who curate this exhibit say, we are history. That's why we cannot accept this art. And you have again the First World War in the middle, but also the education that Hitler had a very classical artist, or so-called artist, before the First World War. And all this is absolutely fascinating, and you are right to point to it.
Anybody else want to? Yes, go to the back. Yes. Yes, there will be, like I said at the beginning, after the coffee break that's coming up after this session, there will be a chance for everybody to share whatever they want to, and we'll do that and close the forum then. But you have something to say about the paper. Oh, you want to say something in that particular time? Okay, then we'll go to James.
Can I just say something that it isn't that relevant, but it relates to Hitler as an artist. And I'm reminded of an exhibition, I'm sure that Jay may have been aware of this with your connections to the White Cube Gallery, that in 2008 there was an exhibition at White Cube London when two very controversial, provocative artists called the Chapman brothers bought 13 of Hitler's watercolours and defaced them with sort of hippie images. Smileys, rainbows, smiley faces, things, stars, and it was obviously an incredibly controversial act. And it sort of reminded me of your distinction between major utopians and minor utopians. Obviously, Hitler, as you define as a cast iron major utopian, but they were trying to sort of undermine that and present him as a minor utopian. That's
right. Yeah, it's very interesting in that the critical commentary to that. My daughter did. Curate that show, and it sold for obscene amounts of money. And the critical commentary range from the views of those who say that it is outrageous to show Hitler at all as an artist, to those who say that any defacement of a work of art is a crime. I mean, it evolved a sense of saying that that art is sacred. And you don't put smileys on art, even if Adolf Hitler painted these, to the exact opposite, saying that any mention of the man's name, bringing the man into the world of art is an obscenity in and of itself. And the fact that it caused such a stir, I think, is worth mentioning. You know, that configuring the Nazi experience is still impossible to do without offending somebody somewhere. It's impossible. You just can't do it. The First World War isn't in that world at all. Oh, you found it, did you?
That's the model of the. They also created an enormous vitrine.
Yeah. Okay. Maybe we can get it up on the screen.
If you can you put internet? I just found it on internet. If you do Chapman, you find immediately on internet.
You see, the point I was trying to make is the First World War is not obscene to represent. Gas warfare, horrible mutilation. But the Nazis and anything to do with him appears still to be. It's a taboo. It's some kind of taboo that doesn't attach to our subject. I wonder why the difference,
Although at the end of the First World War, there were some paintings that couldn't be shown.
Couldn't be shown, that's right. Nevinson was...
The sculpture. Yeah. The sculpture couldn't be shown.
And the painting of, what is it, the cherubim that Orpin did had to be painted over?
That's right.
In front of the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier and Warrior, rather? Yeah. There were taboos, but we're still stuck with them 60 years later. It's quite incredible.
Pardon me?
Dr. Winter, were those original?
Sorry?
Were those Hitler's originals?
Yes, they were watercolors from Munich, actually. This is the interesting juxtaposition of the Blaue Reiter.
I think they bought them for about, they bought a job lot. They bought 13 or so for about £130,000 or something like that. But this was just part of the show. That work was called "If Hitler Was a Hippie, How Happy We Would Be."
That's it. Think of that.
But another part of the work was this enormous vitrine, which has a story of an interesting story in its own right. This is what's up on the part of what's up here. That they produced an enormous work that was made from children's, is it Warhammer models or something like that, where they created this apocalyptics of Nazi landscape. And that was burnt actually in a fire about 5-6 years ago. So they made a sequel. And right in the corner, I mean, the piece of work is probably the size of this room, I suppose. And right in the corner, there's this tiny little figure of Hitler with his palette, as though the minor utopian is responsible for this major dystopia.
This is Hieronymus Bosch in sort of children's lead soldier size images of Nazis committing atrocities of every conceivable kind of the world. Sold for millions.
And you can see here, these are some of his watercolors there. I don't know if you can see them, with the rainbows, sort of Kandinsky-style rainbows painted over them. There's one of them.
Yes.
I was really shocked to realize as I teach three.
Could you speak up?
Yes.
I can't hear. I can't hear.
This past year, I taught 3 sections of Art 100, and in the first, somebody brought up the question of who is Hitler, and I was stunned. I guess I'm thinking these students were born in like 1993, and so then I surveyed all the others, and there was a large number, and they're Canadian students, so maybe that's part of it, but a large number of students who don't have any previous information on Hitler, and so I'm wondering if this may change quickly. I mean, there is a general sort of sense about art and what it is to damage art, but then separate from that, in this case, there is a sense of Hitler's renown, and so I'm wondering if this with a new generation of coming of age that maybe don't have grandparents who were in the war and the Holocaust.
30 seconds. My hesitation. There are too many Hitler internet sites to believe that he's out of. I mean, Hitler internet games, Nazi. Surrealist, black leather. Well, all right, but the internet, I think, the internet is the answer. It can't be stamped out. It's just too big.
Oh, that's great. There you go.
But he died in it. Yeah, I think we were at the.
I think we're at the end of. You can hear the discussion. I'd like to give the audience a round of applause as well as the speakers.